Most people don't think of the United States as an empire. Public perception dictates that the United States is a flourishing democracy, destroying empires one military intervention at a time. We're like the underdogs of the world. I mean, we literally came into being defeating the British Empire. We're the good guys. We stand for democracy, human rights, and justice against the axis of evil, trying to destroy everything that we hold dear, like next day Amazon Prime shipping and the Wendy's 4 for 4. In a rapidly changing world, that junior cheeseburger topped with American cheese, pickles, onions, mustard, and ketchup on a toasted bun is the only constant. But I digress. American historian Daniel Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States, gets to the heart of the question. Is the United States an empire? Spoilers, yes. The answer is yes. Yes, it is. It is. Pop quiz. What do Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands all have in common? If you guess that they're all U.S. territories, you're right. But the line between a territory and a colony is pretty blurry. This year, Puerto Ricans will be able to vote for their independence. But of course, they can only become independent if Congress permits it. Well, you know, freedom is slavery and all that. In 1940, 1 out of 8 people in the United States lived outside of the continental U.S. For comparison, in the United States in 1940, only 1 out of every 12 people was African American. In 1940, we also had a considerably greater amount of territory than we do now. The Philippines, for example, was an American territory from 1899 to 1946, just after the Second World War. Let's talk about the Second World War for a second. Pop quiz! Why did the United States get involved in the Second World War? Do 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 do. Ding ding ding! If you said Pearl Harbor, you get a sticker. But what you might not know is that Japan didn't only bomb Pearl Harbor, which was in the then territory of Hawaii. It also bombed the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, and Wake Island, all American territories at the time. But when President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, he left out all those islands. Originally, Roosevelt's speech read, "Japanese air squadrons have commenced bombing in Hawaii and the Philippines." Yet, in his address to Congress, he changed it to, "Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in Oahu." The change was intentional. FDR knew his audience. Americans at the time, frankly, did not give a damn about the remote territories of the Philippines and Guam. Hell, Americans today don't give a damn about Guam. They hardly viewed those territories as parts of the United States if they even knew that they belonged to the United States at all, even though legally they did. So FDR wanted to emphasize that there was an attack on Hawaii because Hawaii was closer to the continental United States geographically, and at the time there were talks going around about possible statehood for Hawaii. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Notice how he emphasizes that Japan is an empire, but the United States is not. In order to properly answer the question of whether or not the United States is an empire, we have to go back to the beginning. Like, the beginning. In 1776, the 13 colonies comprising the United States declared independence from Britain. As the story goes, over the next 100 years, vagabonds and rabble-rousers, otherwise known as frontiersmen, would go on to realize the ambition of westward expansion. Sea to shining sea and all that. However, the founders of the country actually held these frontiersmen in very low esteem. John Jay wrote that they were, quote, white savages. George Washington warned against settling, or rather overspreading the western country by a parcel of banditti who will bid defiance to all authority. There were two reasons for these objections. The first is that to the dismay of the so-called banditti, the land west of the Appalachians was already populated by indigenous nations. Expanding west meant invading native lands, which obviously wasn't a problem morally speaking, but it was an issue financially speaking. At its founding, the United States government was kind of weak. It couldn't even control the settlers going west, and it couldn't govern them when they got there. Eventually, those settlers would come into conflict with Native American tribes and pull the government into costly wars that it did not want. So George Washington, for example, he wasn't against expansion at all. He just wanted it to happen little by little, in controlled measures. So, to realize this vision, the founders decided that the western land would go to the government, administered not as states, but as territories. Territories are like states, but with less rights. They essentially functioned as colonies. James Monroe wrote, "In effect, it was a colonial government similar to that which prevailed in these states previous to the Revolution. The federal government basically had absolute power over the territories. The territories with at least 60,000 free inhabitants could become states, but only with the permission of Congress. States that tried to become part of the Union but were impeded by Congress include Lincoln, West Dakota, Deseret, Cimarron, and Montezuma. Something changed which propelled more and more settlers west: the size of the population. At the time of independence, the size of the population of the United States was between 3 and 4 million. I bet the rents were so cheap. By 1900, it was 76 million. The demographic boom made prosecuting squatters no small task, and by the 1830s, the government acquiesced and allowed squatters to buy Western land. But what of the Native Americans? Well, the Europeans brought over all kinds of diseases from the Old World, like smallpox, typhus, and measles, which decreased Native American numbers substantially. Disease alone caused what some scholars estimate to be a 90% decline in population. But they weren't all gone. In 1800, the indigenous population was estimated to be about 500,000. And that's partly why the founders didn't want to expand so quickly, because they were trying to avoid the so-called Indian Wars. The Cherokee Nation, for example, was a bastion of strength, a tribe that stretched across modern-day Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. Some Cherokee assimilated into European culture to survive. They even bought slaves, ran plantations, and adopted a constitution in 1827 modeled on the U.S. Constitution. At first, under George Washington's administration, the government had more or less respected the Cherokees' land claims. But then gold was discovered in the Cherokee Nation, and all bets were off. Andrew Jackson approved the theft of Cherokee land, even though the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Man, fuck that guy. Every time there's a problem, it's that guy. But what's a Supreme Court ruling in the grand scheme of things? The settlers poured in, kicking the Cherokee out of their homes. No, like they literally kicked them out of their homes. In 1835, John Ross, the president of the Cherokee tribe, returned home to find a white man living in his house. Then he had to leave his nice estate and move into a 1-bedroom log cabin. Stop! Thief! Other Cherokee were similarly harassed. Eventually, a faction of Cherokee decided to sign a treaty with the federal government, which promised them new land, the land that was acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. 16,000 Cherokee refused to go, which prompted the government to send thousands of militiamen to force them to go at gunpoint. They were then relocated to present-day Oklahoma. They undertook the march on foot, a journey which is popularly known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of disease and starvation. These white people, man, they come to your house, they kick you out of your house, they take your nice little estate and force you to live in a log cabin. The next idea was to establish a territory in the West just for Native Americans. The land was to be called Indian Country, but even that would be short-lived. In the 1840s, Texas was annexed and parts of Mexico were conquered. Gold was discovered in the West. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Congress carved out 2 new states out of Indian Country. Indian Country continued to be carved into pieces until all that remained of it was present-day Oklahoma. Ironically enough, Oklahoma is apparently actually an indigenous word. It's a Choctaw word, which means red people. Interesting to name a place after the people that you kicked out of it. When you think about it, the government was the first to do a land acknowledgement, the acknowledgement that this is no longer your land. And even then, whites started pouring in illegally, despite the fact that this was what little land the natives had left, and the government had assured them that they could live there unmolested. Newspaper The Cherokee Advocate wrote, "No matter how little is left the red man, such heartless wretches will never rest content or let the government rest until the Indians are made landless and homeless. It is beyond the power of words to express the character of such men, dead to all human feeling and knowing no law." Not a lot of presidents actually participated in the settlement boom. Theodore Roosevelt, however, did. He wrote, "The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him." At the end of the United States. Could be, I don't know, could be in 2 weeks. At the end of the 19th century, the United States was industrializing. Immerwahr writes, "The more countries industrialized, the more they depended on the produce of distant locales. They found themselves needing rubber from Southeast Asia, palm oil from West Africa, tungsten from Korea, and copper from South America." So there were 2 ways that the United States could acquire these necessary resources from other countries. Number 1, buy from them. Number 2, conquer them. The choice is easy. Here's the thing about buying something from another country or buying something from one specific country. It means that you are vulnerable to the whims of that particular country. So say during times of war, you get completely cut off, that means that you won't have that resource that might be completely necessary to your economy, which is what happened to the United States during the Second World War with rubber, which is why they were asking their civilians to give them old rubber from their own tires. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt realized his imperialist ambitions by eagerly pushing the United States into the Spanish-American War. Mind you, he wasn't even president at the time. He was assistant secretary of the Navy. I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now. But he was very persuasive. The actual president at the time, William McKinley, did not want war because he had fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union, and he had seen some shit. But Theodore Roosevelt was out for blood, and he was not about to take no as an answer. In 1897, he said, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." And why not a little war to pass the time? That's the American way. America runs on military intervention. And in 1898, Theodore Roosevelt had his opportunity. In the late 19th century, Spain was losing control over its empire. There were rebellions in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. In Cuba, Spain responded forcefully to these rebellions and hundreds of thousands died. Watching closely from the United States, Theodore Roosevelt saw this as an opportunity. He personally volunteered to invade Cuba. That's how passionate he was about this. He was willing to put his own life on the line. But President McKinley, being a man of reason, decided to show restraint. Instead of outright invading the country, he stationed a warship called the USS Maine on the coast of Havana. Great, right? Wrong. In February of 1898, the warship exploded, killing 262 Americans. Now, McKinley, God bless his heart, didn't want to jump to conclusions. I don't propose to be swept off my feet by the catastrophe. The country can afford to withhold its judgment and not strike an avenging blow until the truth is known, he said. Meanwhile, Olympic gymnast Theodore Roosevelt was somersaulting to conclusions. Theodore Roosevelt was not an Olympic gymnast. Dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards. McKinley is bent on peace, I fear, he said. Mind you, it turns out that most likely the ship just exploded because it had a spontaneous combustion in its coal bunkers, so there's that. But that wasn't going to stop our guy Teddy, okay? We're Americans. We have a can-do attitude. We don't stop. We don't stop at anything, even truth. Truth can't stop us. Nothing can stop us. Reality is what we make it. The Secretary of the Navy at the time, Commodore George Dewey, was out on other business. Roosevelt, being second in command, took the opportunity to prepare for war. He saw his opportunity and he took it! Henry Adams wrote on Theodore Roosevelt volunteering to invade Cuba. Is his wife dead? Has he quarreled with everybody? Is he quite mad? Finally, President McKinley caved. The United States invaded both the Philippines and Cuba, two possessions of the ailing Spanish Empire. As promised, Roosevelt himself invaded Cuba, which you can see footage of here. Although this footage was a reenactment, that actually is Roosevelt in 1898. Neat! History is fun. The United States won a decisive victory against Spain, mostly because the Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans had been tiring the Spaniards out with rebellion after rebellion for decades. But unfortunately for the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans, and the Filipinos, although they had fought for their own independence, they would end up just replacing one occupying power with another. Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, and it threw in Guam and Puerto Rico for free. BOGO! This is a map of the United States in 1900. You can see the Philippines down here, but this is a very low resolution image that I'm pretty sure you can't see because it's not in focus. But trust, a map of the greater United States in 1900. Once the United States had the cogs of the Spanish Empire, it didn't really know what to do with them. With respect to the Philippines, President McKinley himself admitted that he could not have told where those darned islands were within 2,000 miles. But he said that the United States would educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could for them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. Before 1898, although the United States had annexed a lot of territory, Louisiana, Florida, Oregon, Texas, parts of Mexico, it had rarely incorporated non-white populations. That's part of the reason that indigenous people were pushed far west into the territories. Congress didn't want them to have a state because then they would have to be accepted into the Union on the basis of equal rights and representation. but that would mess with the already in place apartheid system they had going. A Virginian representative put it quite neatly. If Congress were to add to our union men of blood and color alien to the people of the United States, where was that right to stop? Why not introduce our brethren of Cuba and Haiti? Why not indeed? When the United States was taking parts of Mexico, some Congresspeople suggested that it should take all of Mexico. We already got this far. There was immediate protest, but not for the reasons that you might think. A senator from South Carolina objected. We have never dreamt of incorporating into the Union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. Are we to associate with ourselves as equals, companions, and fellow citizens the Indians and mixed races of Mexico? There were anti-imperialists in Congress, but funny enough, a lot of them were against imperialism for the same reason as those Southern senators. They did not want non-whites in the Union. Theodore Roosevelt was racist as well, but in a different direction. Give us something new. Give us something fresh. He wrote, "We ought to take Hawaii in the interest of the white race." He had a lot of ire for the anti-imperialists, and he said that their doctrines, if carried out, would make it incumbent upon us to leave the Apaches of Arizona to work out their own salvation, and to decline to interfere in a single Indian reservation. Their doctrines condemn your forefathers and mine for ever having settled in these United States. Good! As they should! The Spanish-American War opened up a whole nother can of worms. Now that their land had been annexed by the United States, were the people that lived in the territories of the Philippines and Cuba American citizens? Not exactly. The Supreme Court ruled in a series of opinions called the insular cases that the Constitution did not apply to U.S. territories. The Constitution was the supreme law of the land, but the territories were not a part of the land. Basically, it was up to Congress what constitutional rights the people in the territories had. And the crazy thing about it is that that's still the case today. Immerwahr writes, "Today, around 4 million people live in those unincorporated territories. People who have no representation in Congress, who cannot vote for president, and whose rights and citizenship remain a gift from Washington." Filipinos fought against their new occupiers. Originally, they had fought with the Americans against the Spanish for their liberation. However, once the Spanish were gone, the Americans quickly took over, leading to the Philippine-American War. Domestically, the war reinvigorated the anti-imperialist camp. The Democratic Party platform in 1900 stated that no nation can long endure half republic and half empire. Imperialism abroad will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home. Not the Democratic Party in 1900 being more progressive in some ways than the Democratic Party. Don't shoot! Don't shoot! I'm just saying. What happened to this anti-imperial stance, Democratic Party? Mark Twain wrote, "There must be two Americas, one that sets the captive free, and one that takes a once captive's new freedom away from him, and picks a quarrel with him with nothing to found it on, then kills him to get his land." Well said. But even though there was criticism of the imperial policy, it wasn't enough to get the government to reverse course. I mean, they had just fought a war to get this land. They weren't about to give it up for moral reasons. In the election of 1900, McKinley was re-elected, and the debate over imperialism was put to bed. After the election, the United States waged war on the Philippines with increased vigor. American soldiers burned towns, tortured insurgents, and enacted a policy of reconcentration, where Filipinos were forced into fortified camps for surveillance purposes. Inside of the camps, civilians were faced with disease and malnutrition. Practically everyone starved, guerrillas and civilians alike. Everyone except for the Americans, that is. Immerwahr writes that the Americans sucked much of the rice, eggs, chickens, fruit, fish, and meat from the Philippine economy. And after there was no longer enough meat in the Philippine economy, the army bought refrigerated beef from Australia. With vaccines, fresh water, sanitation, and ample food, U.S. forces were only grazed by the diseases that decimated the colony. This is demonstrated in the death toll on both sides. The Philippine-American War killed upwards of 4,200 Americans. Including those who died of famine, disease, and violence, it killed 775,000 Filipinos. Some congressmen protested. We crushed the only republic in Asia. In the Philippines, the United States killed men, women, and children alike, and for what exactly? For doing the same thing that we had done just a few decades earlier? For fighting for their independence? This is a picture of American soldiers standing over the bodies of the Moro people, a group that lives in the southern Philippines. When the Moro people resisted U.S. occupation, many of them were killed in what is now known as the Budajo Massacre. Mark Twain wrote of the massacre, "We abolished them utterly, leaving not even a baby alive to cry for its dead mother. This is incomparably the greatest victory that was ever achieved by the Christian soldiers of the United States." W.E.B. Du Bois said that the photo was the most illuminating thing I have ever seen, and considered showing it in his classroom to impress upon the students what wars, and especially wars of conquest, really mean. You know, it's nice to know that there were some people that disagreed with these massacres while they were going on. Sometimes it feels like, looking back in history, it's like imperialism, yay. But there's people like Mark Twain and W.E.B. Du Bois who are like, this is actually kind of messed up. Why are we going to people's land and killing them because they don't want to be occupied by us when we don't want to be occupied by others? After the Spanish-American War, the United States occupied Cuba. The McKinley administration was concerned with stabilizing Cuba, which really meant that making sure the situation was amenable to American business interest. Americans owned Cuban sugar fields, Cuban mines, Cuban land, Cuban tobacco, and Cuban banks. To this end, Americans made sure that the Cubans put a clause in their constitution which gave the United States the right to invade it, which it did, not once, not twice, not thrice, but whatever the fourth version of that is. It invaded Cuba 4 times. Immerwahr writes, "The United States seized the levers of finance and trade, but left sovereignty formally intact. To ensure political and financial stability, U.S. troops entered Cuba 4 times, Nicaragua 3 times, Honduras 7 times, the Dominican Republic 4 times, Guatemala and Panama 6 times, Costa Rica and Mexico 3 times, and Haiti twice between 1903 and 1934. Woo! Oh, brother. When Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, colonized subjects of the world celebrated. Wilson was a Southern Democrat, back when the Democrats were more like the Republicans, and grew up during the last years of the Confederacy. Ooh. He had likened the way that the Union had treated the former Confederate states after the Civil War to the way that the United States treated its colonies, calling the former Confederate states conquered possessions. You got the right idea, but... For that reason, Woodrow Wilson was an anti-imperialist. The only problem was, he was kind of racist as fuck. I mean, he grew up in the Confederate South. What did you expect? His father was a pastor who wrote a pamphlet defending slavery called Mutual Relations of Masters and Slaves as Taught in the Bible. Oh, biblical justifications for slavery. That would be a great video idea, but next time. Wilson also famously showed the pro-KKK film The Birth of the Nation at the White House. Was a promoter of the whole lost cause thing. that the Civil War wasn't actually about slavery. If you come into my comments and tell me that the Civil War isn't about slavery, you're gonna fucking hear from me, I swear to God. While he was president at Princeton, he kept black students from being admitted. Good old American racism. But Wilson was more of the people of color are children who can't govern themselves type of racist, not the Rudyard Kipling white man's burden kind of racist. There's a difference. For example, he invaded Latin America several times, saying, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." Good men like you? Good men like you, Woodrow Wilson? However, he was against the annexation of the Philippines and ended military rule there. He supported setting the colony free once it reached the ever-elusive requirement of stable government as deemed by the Americans. Today, Wilson is mostly remembered for being the sitting president during World War I, for his 14 points, and for his failed. But we should also remember what he represented to the colonized people of the world. Failed promises and dashed hopes. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the territories gained much more significance. Up until that point, the American government had made very little effort to fortify the territories against possible attack. Immerwahr writes, "Across the empire, backwaters became battle stations, and with the military came federal money, washing indiscriminately over lands long parched by neglect. For example, in Alaska and Hawaii, militarization happened at an alarming rate. For example, in Hawaii, as soon as the bombs fell, the governor suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which ensures that you need to be brought in front of a court to be charged with a crime rather than just being held indefinitely, and he turned the territory over to military rule. Because 1/3 of the population of Hawaii was of Japanese ancestry, they were treated with extreme suspicion. They were closely monitored, thrown in jail on petty charges, and fined." Japanese internment camps during World War II in the United States are well known, but what is lesser known is the internment camps that the United States imposed on Filipinos of Japanese ancestry in the Philippines in 1941. The American government also interned Guamanians, people from Guam, and Aleut Native Americans during the war. In the case of the Philippines, American General Douglas MacArthur rounded up 30,000 Japanese in the Philippines and imprisoned them. However, their imprisonment was short-lived because Japan invaded and occupied the Philippines only a few weeks later. Ironically, the anxiety surrounding the Japanese civilians at the time is that they would have dual loyalties and perhaps side with the Empire of Japan. But probably in part, due to their imprisonment, the Japanese in the Philippines sided with Japan almost unanimously, welcoming them as liberators. I don't know, it kind of makes sense to me. The Americans were the ones that imprisoned you anyway, so it's not like things were going great here. You might as well see what the other side has to offer. The American government thought that it would have the same problem with the indigenous people of Alaska. After all, the United States government had imposed a Jim Crow type of segregation against them, and who's to say that if you give them guns to go fight the Japanese, they won't just turn those guns on the United States? But that actually wasn't the case at all. Despite the fact that they weren't even paid and they did not even receive uniforms, 6,300 indigenous Alaskans signed up for the military, ranging from ages 12 to 80. 80. It's very interesting how minorities within the United States have always fought on behalf of the country while simultaneously being oppressed inside of the country. And the same thing was happening in the Philippines. Tens of thousands of Filipinos were a part of Douglas MacArthur's regiment, alongside 22,000 American troops. But when Japan invaded the Philippines, the American government basically threw their hands up. They left them for dead. All of them, Americans and Filipinos alike. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt chose to prioritize defending Britain over defending the Philippines due to the Germany First strategy. Deal with Nazi Germany first before Japan. Immerwahr writes, What right did the United States have to drag the Philippines into a war and then abandon it? Why was Washington defending an imperialist power, Britain, while letting its own people perish? MacArthur warned Roosevelt that an almost violent resentment was brewing in the Philippines towards the United States. I'm not exactly sure why. Either FDR did not care or he was busy with other matters, but he doubled down and ordered all top-ranking military officials out of the Philippines. Like, they were abandoning it, but for real this time. The Filipino and American soldiers that were left behind were captured by the Japanese. In the aptly named Bataan Death March, 76,000 prisoners of war, 66,000 Filipinos, and 10,000 Americans walked over 60 miles to a military camp. They were beaten, shot, bayoneted, and sometimes beheaded. Many of those who actually made it to the camp died of disease and starvation. So the Philippines went from being a Spanish possession to an American possession to a Japanese possession. These guys can't get a break. Under Japan, Filipinos were starving to death. The Philippines Minister of Culture complained that there was, quote, thousands of cases of people being either burned alive, killed at the point of bayonet, beaten without mercy, or otherwise subjected to various methods of physical torture without distinction as to age or sex. The United States did eventually circle back to the Philippines. In October of 1944, 200,000 American soldiers, led by MacArthur, stormed the Philippine beaches. The Battle of Manila was a bloody affair. Japanese generals ordered that all non-Japanese on the battlefield be killed. This was the only time during the war that Americans would fight Japanese troops in a major city, and the carnage was immense. The American military used a tactic of bombing buildings that they thought that Japanese soldiers might be in, whether they were hospitals, refugee centers, or people's homes. A local journalist wrote of the wreckage, "The largest buildings had been transformed into mere piles of rubber and debris. Over areas, miles square, hardly one stone was left on top of another. It was as if all the forces of destruction had operated together, and that even this had been exceeded. This seemed demonic work." Ultimately, 10,010 Americans, 16,665 Japanese, and 100,000 Filipinos were killed. What's interesting about this particular example of the role that the Philippines played in World War II is that it kind of illustrates the contradictory nature of the colonial system. Filipinos were U.S. nationals, but their lives were treated as if they were expendable. Why did the United States give up its empire? Trick question. It didn't. Well, not really. Yes, after emerging victorious in the Second World War, the United States gave up territory. The long-suffering Philippines, for example, was set free. But in other ways, World War II had made the United States more of a global power than ever. During the course of the war, the United States had 2,000 overseas base sites. After the war, it downsized. It was still an empire, just an empire fit for the 21st century. The Second World War marked a global shift. The colonized people of the world stood up all at once. I would say it had something to do with the fact that colonized people were told that they were fighting fascism abroad, but they were experiencing fascism at home. Let us discuss the contradiction. The Double V campaign kind of highlighted this contradiction, referring to African Americans fighting in the war for Double V, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. And that wasn't the only instance of American soldiers recognizing the hypocrisy in American foreign policy. Following the First World War, the soldiers had returned home as civilians within a year. But after the Second World War, the government wanted to keep the American soldiers abroad to maintain the peace of the entire world. The Truman administration was especially concerned with Asia. In China, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, and the Philippines, armies were being built up. In China, it was Mao Zedong's Red Army. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh. This was not a welcome turn of events for the Truman administration. There were valuable resources in Southeast Asia, such as the rubber plantations, which caused so much fuss during the Second World War, that the Truman administration did not want falling into the wrong hands, if you know what I mean. So Truman ordered the military to stay overseas. This was not received well. The soldiers gathered by the thousands to protest in the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, and Korea. "What kind of government is this?" a soldier exclaimed. "What are we that we scream piously, 'The world must be free,' and then keep it to ourselves?" The members of the 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, an all-African regiment, wrote a letter to President Truman. They were disgusted with undemocratic American foreign policy and didn't want to be associated with the shooting and bombing to death the freedom urge of the peoples of the Southeast Asiatic countries. "We do not want to unify China with bayonets and bombing planes." Ultimately, the soldiers were sent home. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii became states. Puerto Rico, however, stayed in territory purgatory. Problems in Puerto Rico, according to the American government, were that it was 1, overpopulated, and 2, extremely poor. Nothing to do with it being an American colony, of course. The good thing about having an overseas territory is that you can do the kinds of things over there that wouldn't fly over here. Immerwahr writes, Puerto Ricans had a history of serving as subjects for experimental medical research, from anemia to mustard gas. This was no different for the invention of the birth control pill. The first experiment on humans for the invention of the birth control pill was done on students at the University of Puerto Rico. Even though their grades were held in the balance, over half of the students dropped out of the trials. Trials were repeated elsewhere. Many Puerto Rican women complained of experiencing side effects, such as cervical erosion, nausea, and stomach pains. Experimenters often neglected to tell the woman the possible side effects, violating the principle of informed consent. The fact that because of technological innovation, the United States could access materials without occupying other people's land, for example, the whole rubber fiasco, because the United States was cut off from rubber production, it created its own synthetic rubber. That means it didn't need to occupy parts of Southeast Asia to ensure access to the rubber markets because it could just make its own. Once I get a hold of my own rubber supply, it's over for you bitches. Friendship ended with colonialism. Now neocolonialism is my best friend. Synthetics such as plastic started to replace basically everything. Immerwahr writes, natural fibers such as cotton, wool, and silk were increasingly replaced by nylon or polyester. Unfortunately, this didn't work for everything. Oil, for example. What American statesman do you think said, "I'm not saying we have to take over Saudi Arabia. How about Abu Dhabi or Libya?" If you guessed Henry Kissinger, you're right! So for oil, we'll still invade a couple countries, but not for like rubber and all that kind of stuff. All in all, rapidly advancing technology made the need for actually conquering territories redundant. With aviation, wireless communication, and a couple hundred military bases, the United States could project power over lands without actually having to take over them. Today, the United States has over 800 military bases all over the world. To illustrate the point, let us take a trip down memory lane. The year is 1945. The State Department wants to build a military base in the oil-rich country of Saudi Arabia, in the city of Dhahran. The Saudi monarchy was okay with it, but the population was not. Americans came over in droves. Many Saudis viewed it as an example of U.S. imperialism. Saudi Arabia is home to both Mecca and Medina Islamic holy lands. So the optics were bad. You know, they were planting an American flag in Muslim holy lands. It didn't look great. The opposition was so great that in 1962, the Saudis ended the lease and the Americans were sent packing. In 1996, Osama bin Laden published his declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. He writes, "So the people of Islam realized that they were the fundamental target of the hostility of the Judeo-Crusader alliance. All the false propaganda about the supposed rights of Islam was abandoned in the face of the attacks and massacres committed against Muslims everywhere, the latest and most serious of which, the greatest disaster to befall the Muslims since the death of the Prophet Muhammad, is the occupation of Saudi Arabia, which is the cornerstone of the Islamic world, place of revelation, source of the prophetic mission. Despite this, it was occupied by the armies of the Christians, the Americans, and their allies." Bin Laden had many gripes with the United States, one being the American support for Israel, which is obvious considering that the Israelis regularly expel and ethnically cleanse Arabs from their own lands. No, I don't support Osama bin Laden. Crazy that you have to say that. The internet these days. But the second aspect, which fueled 9/11, was that American imperialism had gone too far. Immerwahr writes, "September 11th was in large part retaliation against the United States for its empire of bases." Like Immerwahr said, today there are about 4 million people living in U.S. territories. Those people do not have voting representatives in Congress, and they also cannot vote for the president, although they are subject to the whims of the American Congress. Remnants of American culture can be found far and wide, and English is the global lingua franca. In 1943, Winston Churchill said, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind." And interestingly enough, many of us can't even speak the languages of our ancestors, which in many cases were stomped out by the forces of colonialism. What's your connection to the American Empire? Do you think American imperial policy is a thing of the past? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you're an American citizen, the election is in 2 weeks. In the description below, I will be putting vote.org so that you can go and see your ballot. Vote! Because it doesn't have to be an empire. Make your voice heard. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. This is The Archive, which is a show about history and politics. If you really enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the Patreon. On the Patreon, I put my live streams that I do every Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be there or be a dog of the American Empire. Goodbye. I wanted to play around with the end screen here, so I'm putting an end screen of me. I should be tiny, and then there should be another video for you to watch over here, and the subscribe button over here. So thank you so much for watching. I gotta go. Goodbye!